Hi. Wow. What a pleasure. Thank you all for coming. What an exciting, it's exciting to have all of you here. Really great. Well, let's dive in. All right. Well, let's start with what you probably already know. The planet is indeed getting warmer. 1.1 degrees centigrade since pre-industrial periods. We can see it in the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Sea levels are rising. Many people in Europe this summer attributed your floods to the increase in global temperatures. Many also attribute higher intensity fires in California as well as in Australia to climate change. This video, these images are part of what Greta Thunberg said scared her into her climate activism, starving polar bears. But that's not the only problem in the world. We know that the black-browed albatross and other sea life are being negatively impacted by plastic waste with these horrifying scenes. And many tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of people have seen this incredible video of a sea turtle with a straw caught up its nose. Marine biologist pulling it out, the hawksbill tortoise. And one sign among many, according to some, that we are in a sixth mass extinction. But the good news we all hear almost every day is that the declining price of solar panels and wind turbines mean that we need not fear and that we just need to deploy renewables, which are, on the one hand, already cheaper than fossil fuels, and on the other hand, just need a little bit more subsidy. And of course, the message has penetrated. Young people know when I interview my daughter's friends, they think that they may not live long enough to have kids. Half of people surveyed by YouGov in 2019 said that humans may go extinct from climate change. 75% of Americans now say they are anxious or depressed from climate change. And 1 out of 5 British children are having nightmares of climate change. But I'm here to say that that's not the end of the story. There's more information that we almost never read in the mainstream news media, but that's important to hear about. The first is that the United States has reduced its carbon emissions more than any other country in the world. Over the last 15 years, it reduced its carbon emissions 22% below 2005 levels. That's 5 percentage points more than it had promised to under Paris climate agreements, which we never ratified, and 5 percentage points more than we had promised to reduce them under cap and trade legislation, which failed in the Senate, never became law, nonetheless happened anyway. British emissions in 2019, we will use the year before the pandemic, which changed things. British emissions were lower than they had been since 1888. And many people, including the International Energy Agency, believe that we are nearing peak global emissions, that global emissions may have already peaked or will peak soon. If you had to ask me, I'd say we have another 10 or maybe 15 years of emissions increases, but most of us believe that they will peak and go down. Some people think that they've been going down for the last decade. This is a study that came out 2 weeks ago today, was published in Carbon Brief, and has not been reported by any major news media, to my knowledge. Only Ars Technica wrote a small piece about it. New revised data set shows that global CO2 emissions were essentially flat. In fact, when 2020 and 2021 are included, the new GCP, that's Global Carbon Project data, actually shows slightly declining global emissions over the past decade, though this should be treated with caution. Our own science advisors say, this is land use-based emissions, but basically there's 3 agencies that do satellite tracking of land use changes, and this is basically saying that there's been less deforestation and more reforestation than they had anticipated. So you can see on the right there, major downward revision in land use emissions over the past decade, resulting in flattened or possibly lower global carbon emissions over the last 10 years. This didn't come out right, but this should show basically declining, just a pretty steady decline of the carbon intensity of energy. That's a measure of carbon emissions per unit of energy in the global economy. Starts with the transition from fuel to coal, then we see from coal to oil, and then to natural gas and to nuclear. We also see an incredible reforestation occurring in Europe, but also in the United States, as marginal farmlands revert back to grasslands and forests because they're no longer needed. We mostly save nature because we don't need it, and we don't need it because it has no economic value, thereby allowing it to be returned to the natural world. We've seen that despite this dramatic image of this pileup, deaths from floods in Europe have declined very significantly over the last 150 years. That mirrors the broader trend of a 90% decline of natural disasters by decade. My friend Bjorn Lomborg has done some new numbers and finds that this is probably closer to 95, 90, 97% when you factor in new numbers over the last decade. I'm not that worried about sea level rise. It's a 0.5 meter sea level rise between now and 2100, and that's partly because I've been to the Netherlands, 1/3 of which is below sea level, some parts of it 7 meters below sea level. At one point, I may have exaggerated a bit. I said that Netherlands became rich because it's below sea level, at which point Richard Toll said, Shellenberger, probably too far. Nonetheless, there is something about you Northern Europeans and the need that you had to develop this incredible technical capacity to live in such miserable weather conditions for so much of the year. The amount of the area of land that is burning globally declined 25%. That's an area about the size of Texas. This is mostly due to increased use of mechanized means rather than slash and burn agriculture for clearing new agricultural land. What about those high-intensity fires? One of the two best California-based forest scientists, Malcolm North, told me climate dries out the wood, the fuels, and extends the fire season from 4 to 6 months to nearly year-round. That's true, he said. But it's not the cause of the intensity of the fires. The cause of that is fire suppression and the existing debt of wood fuel. He was, shortly after giving this interview, the U.S. Forest Service, his employer, said that he could no longer speak to reporters. It's a gift I have. If you care about polar bears as I do, then maybe you guys should stop hunting them and killing them. Twice as many polar bears were killed by hunters as exist in the wild today. The National Geographic was forced to apologize for the videos and photographs that traumatized poor Greta Thunberg and apparently many other Swedish children and children around the world. We have no idea why that polar bear was starving to death, guys. That was pretty silly by National Geographic. Some climate skeptics say that polar bears are increasing. Some climate alarmists say the population of polar bears is decreasing. Naturally, both sides are wrong. We have no idea how many polar bears there are because they're just too darn hard to count. And the extrapolations that people make about these polar bears is inappropriate. What about plastic straws? They're trivial in terms of the quantity of the plastic waste that they contribute to the environment. It is true that the black-browed albatross is killed by plastic waste, but the far larger source of mortality are fishing boats. They get caught in the hooks, eating the fish that are in those long lines that get dropped, and also by invasive predators, not by plastic. It's not to say we shouldn't worry about plastic. We should. Nobody wants plastic waste in the oceans, but we should be clear about what we're trying to do and how we're trying to do it. My most favorite discovery was this discovery that the original plastic used for what we call tortoiseshell glasses, you're all familiar with it. I have a pair myself, fake tortoiseshell glasses, that they used to be made from sea turtle shells. They would take the sea turtles and roast them over a hot fire and then peel the shells off the turtles. That's just how much people were in harmony with nature back then. And they would then heat the shells further, and it became one of the original bioplastics. And in fact, we saw a significant decline of the hawksbill sea turtle population as a result of the over-harvesting of their shells for plastic. So your wonderful glasses that you're wearing are made from a petrochemical byproduct, a waste byproduct. You're using all parts of the elephant. Is that an expression here? All parts of the buffalo, is that an expression in Denmark? I heard in Hungary they said all parts of the pig. You're using all parts of the petrochemical process by downcycling those plastics. Of course, an even more famous original bioplastic is the ivory from elephant trunks. So we should be glad that we're making those out of petrochemical waste rather than out of natural products. Mostly good news with the sea turtle population. Population size of sea turtles is increasing around the world rather than decreasing. This is considered one of the great conservation success stories. It is reason to be inspired and to go into marine biology and to really enjoy this remarkable planet that we have inherited, and we're able to give it back by finding good substitutes. What about plastics? I hear this is less of a problem in Denmark, but we have a huge problem in the United States, which is that we pretend to recycle our plastics. In truth, we have been shipping them to places like China and increasingly Southeast Asia and increasingly to Africa, where they then also pretend to recycle them, and they don't properly dispose of them, and a significant quantity of the so-called recycled plastics ends up, you guessed it, in the ocean. Now, most of it happily does dissolve. You may remember from your high school ecological biology class that the solution to pollution is dilution. When scientists went out and actually tried to count how much plastic waste was out there, they were only able to find 0.1% of it. So plastic does break down, but of course we don't want to put plastic in the ocean. So therefore, do what I think you do in Denmark, which is to either landfill or incinerate your waste. At one point, they were worried about incinerators because they produce dioxin, but now they burn so hot that the dioxin molecules break apart and they produce very little carbon dioxide. We have tons of space to make golf courses and walkways, and we just tend to landfill our waste, which is fine. So let's take a closer look at some of these processes, because it's good to have a broader view. We sometimes, part of the way we get anxiety is by not being able to see a broader picture of what's going on in the world. So the thing that we can't celebrate enough is the fact that almost half of us lived in extreme poverty 40 years ago. Now less than 10% do. We are living so much longer, which is why we're so narcissistic and neurotic. We now live 70 years and we want to live 90, 100 years. We're not satisfied. We want to be very old. And we produce so much food. I mean, who doesn't struggle with this? We have so much food around us. 25% more food than we need. It's in astonishing quantities of food. Too much food. We have to get rid of the food so the farmers don't go bankrupt. 25% surpluses. For a long time, we've been trying to dump it on poor countries. We now know that destroys their local farming economies. Nonetheless, tons and tons of food in the world. It's not a problem. What about climate change? Isn't that going to make it too hot to grow food? The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization has studied this question for decades, and what they find is that irrigated systems are going to continue to see yields increase. So let's look at irrigated systems first. So this is a little bit confusing, but basically here's the broken down by crop. All crops, if nothing is done in terms of making technological innovations in agriculture, then you could see some very, very modest reductions in yields in the irrigated systems. But if you do take the basic measures of improving your fertilizer, irrigation, and other technologies, you get very large increases in yields under higher temperatures. Some in rain-fed systems, places like sub-Saharan Africa, you could see even bigger declines under climate change if you don't adapt, which would be for farmers to stop behaving like farmers. But if farmers continue to behave as farmers, then we should continue to see very significant increases in yields. So we're not going to run out of food, which of course has the downside that we're going to have to struggle with too much food in the future. Nonetheless, we see yields are rising. This is just the United States, but it's true for all over the world. We really can't talk enough about the importance of this to the environment. The more food we produce on the less land is the more land we have for all those endangered species that we want to save. And in particular, I'll say humans, the way to think of it, humans use half the ice-free surface of the Earth. Even the greatest scientists in the world, like Edward Wilson from Harvard, are profoundly ignorant about how much of the Earth we use. He proposed that we save half of the Earth from human use for the natural environment. Nobody had told him, he wrote a whole book on this, nobody had told him that we already do save half of the Earth for the natural environment, and that he doesn't have enough ambitions. He should be much more ambitious than that. We should try to use a quarter. His book was called Half Earth, Half the Earth. Should have been called 3/4 Earth, or 90% Earth if you were really eco-modernist. So we use half the Earth, and almost all that we use for food production, also some timber, pulp, and paper. Just 0.5% is for cities, just 0.5% is for energy production. That's all the oil and gas, all the coal, all the nuclear, all the hydro. And then half of that half is just for meat production. So the youth activists are onto something when they want you to go vegetarian, but what they're leaving out of that is the ways in which we've reduced the amount of land that we use for meat production by an area almost the size of Alaska since the year 2000. How did we do it? Pretty simple. Think about how you can have 100 heads of cow on a single hectare of land, or one. So if you increase the amount of heads of cow or pigs or chickens or whatever on a piece of land, then you don't need to use as much land. In Apocalypse Never, I describe, are there ethical concerns about this? Certainly there are some unsolved ethical concerns for chicken production, which we haven't quite figured out yet. But for cows, it turns out that cows are actually happy if they're in clean, well-lit stalls without swinging chains and other surprising, shadowy things. Cows are not humans, so it takes people like Temple Grandin, who identifies deeply with cow experience and can empathize with cows, to see what really freaks out cows are the things you wouldn't think of, just the surprising noises and the swinging chains. They don't mind being all huddled together. They like a clean stall. They don't need to be out there on the hillsides in the romantic way that the German Green Party imagines they need to be. They can handle a certain amount of concentration if we treat the cows well. What about natural disasters? Are natural disasters becoming more expensive? Do natural disasters cost more? Are they becoming more expensive? Yes, unless you account for the fact that we're all so much richer. So it turns out that when you factor in GDP, there's two ways to do this. You can just factor for GDP, or you can try to do specific accounting of the increase in wealth in specific places. But either way, globally, the cost of natural disasters when you factor in GDP is actually going down. There's no increase in hurricane frequency. In fact, you can see here these slides, which I'm stealing with permission from Roger Pilkey Jr. We can see a very slight increase in hurricane frequency over the last 120 years. Similarly, nature has found the same thing. No increase in hurricane damage when normalized for wealth. Why is that? Well, there just wasn't as much wealth on Miami Beach or in other parts of the world today as there was 100 years ago. What about flooding? Somehow these got a little messed up, but basically the picture you saw before, we're seeing larger areas flooded around the world, but that's causing less damage. So that makes sense because you can see here, 1950, the cities around rivers, which is a lot of our cities, particularly in Europe, but really everywhere, as they get more people in them, that just means that more people are going to be experiencing flooding during that period. But the infrastructure has gotten so much better that it causes less damage. So when you go to Jakarta in Indonesia and you interview the people that live near the rivers that are flooded, it's because they haven't put in place the proper flood management systems. Part of the problem with climate alarmism is the ways in which it constructs ignorance. It teaches people to not see certain things that are all around them, like the fact that we have this incredible flood management and water management system that we've developed over the last 150 years. We should all be grateful for. My house actually does flood a little bit every year, and it's because they haven't yet come up to my house to fix the flood management system. So that's not something that should be the cause of a million retweets every time Greta tweets a photo of somebody flooding. What about hurricanes? We have a consensus among really all the scientists that look at this, as assembled by the United States government's National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They all agree that the total frequency of North Atlantic hurricanes, but also the global frequency of tropical cyclones, which is what we call hurricanes in Asia, that it should decrease over time, even as the intensity of those hurricanes increase by 5%. So do we think that hurricanes are going to cause a lot more damage in the future? Not really. Not if you think 5% more intense winds and hurricanes are going to cause much damage. Not really anybody thinks that's going to happen. What about drought? The area in drought has actually declined in the United States over the last 20 years. We see no pattern with droughts. One of the things about droughts is that we have these crazy epic droughts at various points in world history. In California, we had 2 mega droughts, which just means droughts that lasted a century or many decades. One of them was in the 10th century, and the other one was in the 12th century. If we have another terrible mega drought, that'd be awful. We just have to manage our water better. What about fire suppression? Until Donald Trump was elected and everybody lost their minds, the left-wing press, of which Mother Jones was one of the best, reported the same thing, which is that the suppression of fire in the forests was why California was having such high-intensity fires. So not all forests, but many forests, including California's montane or mountain forests, our famous Sierra Nevada forests, they needed fires. The Europeans that arrived, when they arrived, they saw the fires burning on the forest floor. They didn't understand that was a good thing, so they would put them out, but they also would log all the forests. And then when we stopped needing all of those forests, we kept putting out those fires, and there would be this accumulation of woody debris on the forest floor. So we know the good news is that we're not doomed to high intensity fires. High intensity fires are like the fires on the left. You can see they're actually burning the crowns of the trees. We don't want those if you like fire, if you like having mountain forests, because it turns those forests into shrublands rather than into these beautiful Sierra forests that we're used to. What you want are these little managed prescribed burns on the right, and we're able to construct those fires. I was the only journalist in the world, and I'm not bragging, I'm actually criticizing the other journalists, to properly report on this issue starting in 2020. And what we discovered, because I was actually interviewing real people rather than engaging in ideological battles, they were telling me, look, they sent me this map. They said, we have proof of it. The fire was burning in the badly managed forest. It arrived in an area called Shaver Lake Forest, and then it dropped to the ground, just like magic. It just dropped because there wasn't all that wood fuel built up on the forest floor. I'm not worried about the fire on our property because it's like a hot prescribed burn, a little bit hotter than normal. It's not like a regular prescribed burn. It's a little bit hotter, but it's not a high intensity fire. But on the Forest Service lands, the badly managed lands, it's all fuel, and so if the fire gets in there, you know it's going to rage, said the Shaver Lake forester. What about the sixth mass extinction? Well, so far, less than 1% of all plant, animal, and insect species that we've documented have gone extinct since 1500. Every extinction to some extent is a tragedy, but it's important to remember that there were extinctions actually going on Earth before humans arrived. We tend to see everything through our narcissistic lens, but in fact, extinction and speciation was going on before humans ever showed up on the scene. We now know from the International Union of Conservation of Nature, which is one of the two scientific bodies that tracks these things, that just 6% of all species on Earth are critically endangered. That's 6% too many for me. We don't want to see any of those species critically endangered. Nonetheless, to be considered a mass extinction, somewhere between 75 and 90% of all species on Earth need to be critically endangered. So happily, we're a long ways from that. And because we're producing more meat, in particular on less land, the chances of a mass extinction are basically zero. What about conservation? It's an incredible record. We have 25 times more designated protected areas in the world today than 1962. Many of these, it's true, are from the horrible experience of colonialism in Africa. In Apocalypse Never, I described visiting the spectacular Virunga Park in the Congo, where people are literally starving and being abused by rebel soldiers around the park. Nonetheless, if the Congo ever got its act together, it could keep its spectacular parks and lift everybody out of poverty. What about, Michael, come on, there's got to be some hidden risk here. That's the response I get. There's got to be some sort of mechanism by which disaster could strike. We have different names for this. The most popular one is called tipping points. And the great analyst Václav Smil, who I think, just to who is as Malthusian as they come, an advisor to Bill Gates, not somebody with whom I agree on many things. Nonetheless, he wrote a whole book called Global Catastrophes and Trends, where he looked at wars, diseases, volcanoes, tsunamis, and asteroids. The book made me a full-on asteroid alarmist. I'm serious. Asteroids are terrifying. If you want to scare children about something, scare them about asteroids, get them to march in the streets to demand more money for asteroid protection and go into asteroid monitoring. I mean, are you kidding me? Asteroids? You're familiar with the dinosaurs? I mean, I thought it was very ironic that the United Nations and its propaganda for the little video it made, it created a CGI computer-generated dinosaur with the actor Jack Black at the beginning of the UN conference that's just occurred, and the dinosaur talking about how we're going to go extinct from climate change. There's no discussion of humans going extinct from climate change. In any United Nations report, they should have been talking about asteroids. That's what got the dinosaurs, people. So wars, diseases, volcanoes, tsunamis, and asteroids, not climate change, pose the highest risk of catastrophe. We're looking at probability and severity are the two axes here. Why is climate change not up there? Because it doesn't register on the probability or severity map. Don't take my word for it. You should read Voslov's book. It's actually quite reassuring, except on the asteroids part. When I graduated from high school, the Associated Press published this article that the UN predicts disaster if global warming is not checked. Certainly, if nothing's done by 2000, it said, we're all doomed. This is very common. If you go back, you can just find this work. But because there's no historical memory, and we all suffer from mass amnesia, nobody seems to be aware of this. Let's just take a closer look at energy, because that's, I think, that's the big prey around the future of humans and the environment and so much else that we're concerned with. One of the things that we now have fully established, we have yet to completely beat it out of the IPCC reports, but nonetheless, we know that energy consumption remains tightly tied to GDP. So did Germany, they'll remind you, they reduced the amount of energy that each person uses in Germany. Congratulations, Germany. They're very proud of that. But they didn't go to Vietnam levels. They didn't go to Indian levels of per capita energy consumption. So bravo, Germany, but you don't get that much credit for it. 20 years ago, really 10 years ago, when we started analyzing the role of energy and energy productivity to economic growth, we discovered that a significant amount of energy efficiency savings, such as making lighting cheaper per unit, we've made lighting like 3,000 times cheaper over the last 200 years, that it doesn't just result in us saving money from lighting, we actually just end up using more lighting. So part of the efficiency of energy, the productivity of energy is a driver of growth. That's okay, but that cancels out much of the efficiency gains. This is important because for a very long time, the assumption in the IPCC reports and in everybody else's was just that we could radically reduce how much energy we use and maintain these very high standards of living. Mostly that was used to try to deny poor countries the energy they need. Now we use other arguments to try to deny poor countries the energy they need, but nonetheless it doesn't tend to be energy efficiency as much as it did. What about air pollution? On most of the big pollutants, we've made extraordinary gains. These numbers will look almost identical in Denmark and the rest of Europe. 83% decline in carbon monoxide, 99% decline in lead, 61% decline in nitrous oxide, 91% decline in sulfur dioxide, mostly as the transition to cleaner burning coal, the transition to more efficient vehicles, transition to natural gas. Basic technical changes. Did regulations play a role in it? Sure, some, but there's also just the normal turnover of capital stock and the desire for engineers to make the next generation of their machines even better. Your smartphone is a nature-saving device. This is the picture that we want to have about what matters for saving the natural environment. It's dematerialization. Try not to use too much jargon, but that's a really good word to use and know. Your smartphone replaces cameras, speakers. Do you guys remember stereo systems? Everyone here that's over 30, you remember stereo systems, right? These components, everybody would have one. They'd have this component here, nobody knew what it did, but then there was the CD player and the radio player and the record thing. It was a nightmare of electronic mess and junk that's now we shipped off to Africa. You're welcome. Now we look back at people that still read newspapers as it's barbarians. What are you doing getting newspapers delivered to your door? We have the forests are finally able to return. The wildlife is coming back thanks to smartphones. But does that mean that we're using less energy? No, because significant quantities of energy are required to provide the services within your iPhone. It's not just the iPhone. That doesn't really take that much energy. It's all the cloud. There's the Bitcoin now. They want to do Bitcoin. That's why they're all going to Iceland to try to get cheap energy to produce gigantic quantities of the services, the energy services behind the iPhone. So the 60s environmentalists they said two things. They said we need to reduce how much energy and resources we use. They got it half right. If you care about the environment, you should reduce how much resources we use, but not how much energy you use, because the energy allows us to reduce the amount of resources we use. So think of, we want to dematerialize, and that also means to decarbonize, but you can see it in the energy sector. Sorry with the jargon here, PWRs, pressurized water reactors, that refers to nuclear power. So you can see PWR. This is a range given. The largest amount of concrete in the PWR versus the lowest amount. And then the CANDO reactor, which I was just informed by the Riso Institute that Denmark considered getting a CANDO reactor. It's the natural uranium nuclear reactor that Canada uses. But you can see that nuclear uses significantly less concrete per unit of energy compared to wind and solar. Same story for steel. So going back to renewables from nuclear or even from natural gas requires a rematerialization of the energy sector, which is also going to reduce the productivity of energy and therefore reduce growth. Naturally, the French have the greatest intuitive understanding of this idea of energy density. Sunlight is energy dilute. That's why you can sunbathe and not die, as opposed to staying next to a nuclear reactor. You won't make it very long. And so sunlight is so dilute, you have to cover deserts with these monstrous solar farms. And this is the dystopian opening to Denis Villeneuve's outstanding Blade Runner, which is the best of his films. It's better than Dune or no, it's not. I love Arrival though. Yeah. But this is a beautiful opening nightmarish sequence. Where did he get this idea from? Oh, he happened to get it from us in California, the nightmarish dystopian scene of the Ivanpah solar farm. As soon as they were constructing it, it was already technologically outdated because it's a bunch of mirrors pointing sunlight at these turbines. That's the center pole, spins the turbine, makes steam, spins the generator, makes electricity. 6,000 birds every year at a minimum are fried by this gigantic solar oven in the desert, using a 19th century, I mean, really, we're being honest, we're talking like what? It's a prehistoric BC technology. So we know, don't take my word for it, it should be in every high school science class, junior high school class. Go to Google Maps, draw a circle around a power plant near you, divide by the amount of electricity it produces, and you've done a power density calculation. I mean, I was terrible at science and math, and I'm able to do these calculations. You can see it takes 370 times more land for solar and nuclear. It works around the world. It's quite remarkable. It's about 300 to 400 around the world. Some places are more like 600 times. Some places get to like 270, but it's a gigantic quantity of land that's required. The biologists who are hired to create these projects have been speaking out against them. Everybody knows that the translocation of desert tortoises doesn't work. When you're walking in front of a bulldozer, crying and moving animals and cacti out of the way, it's hard to think the project is a good idea, said one of the biologists hired to rip baby tortoises out from their burrows. These are tortoises that are prehistoric. They're ancient animals. They are the state reptile. They are endangered species. And so we're killing them as a sacrifice to the climate gods in California because we are the neo-pagan climate worshippers, so we're sacrificing our endangered desert tortoises. Solar panels, because they're all natural, they compost, don't they? They don't, it turns out. Solar panels contain lead, which means that as soon as you rip them off the roofs and you chuck them into the gigantic cardboard box on your driveway, which is how we take them off our roofs in California, they instantly are classified as hazardous waste under California law, and there's 300 times more waste per unit of energy than the high level waste that nuclear plants puts out. Can't batteries save us? 4 hours of backing up the U.S. electrical grid with Elon Musk's lithium batteries would cost, a mere $750 billion. Right? Why would anybody be worried about that as a financial problem? Obviously not a solution. Even the biggest advocates of renewables don't think that batteries are going to save us. So the picture is a picture of going from matter-dense fuels to energy-dense fuels, from carbon-intensive fuels to hydrogen-intensive fuels, dematerialization. Coal is about 1 carbon atom per hydrogen atom, depending on the quality of the coal. Natural gas, as everybody knows, is CH4, 1 carbon atom to 4 hydrogen atoms, until you get to the greatest, the most beautiful of all energy sources, which is uranium, which should produce close to 0 carbon emissions, not technically, but close. And then hydrogen gas eventually to power our fuel cell cars. This is the best available annual data that I just created into these slides a few days ago. This is Sweden, France, Denmark, and Germany. You always have Germany to look down on. I know that's important for folks in Denmark. So you can look down on Germany, but you still have France there, guys, and Sweden. Oof, that's tough. 1/10 of the carbon emissions is you guys. And you're paying very expensive paying for very expensive electricity. It's okay, you're rich. You can use your money to build gigantic windmills and burden your neighbors with the excess electricity when you have too much of it. But you can still see it's Sweden and France that are the heavy nuclear countries that have that are the cleanest, the cheapest, and heavy in nuclear, which is that beautiful yellow there at the bottom. And Denmark burdened with a significant amount of renewables, and Germany going the wrong direction. Same story in California. We've increased our electricity prices 7 times more than in the rest of the United States. Everybody's electricity prices should have gone down because natural gas became so cheap. It became cheaper than coal, which was something that 20 years ago when I started working on climate change, people said was literally not possible. People thought there was some physical barrier to any energy being cheaper than coal. That was literally how people thought. We made natural gas cheaper than coal. Turns out you just stick a pipe in the ground and you can just quickly frack the shale a couple more times and gas emerges. That's a lot cheaper than having to remove an entire mountain. Leon Hirth, a very young economist, German, brilliant, publishes a study in 2013 where he perfectly predicts the impact that wind energy and solar would have on electricity prices. He predicted that when wind became 30% of your electricity, it would decline in value by 40%, and then when solar became 15%, it would decline in value of 50%. This has been beautifully validated in California. This is what you want as an economist, because they think they're little physicists. They want to be able to have predictive power. Leon Hirth wins. Had Germany spent the $580 billion on nuclear instead of renewables, by 2025, it would already be getting 100% of its energy from electricity and transportation from clean, zero-emission sources. So maybe it's not about climate change. This is a study that was also conducted in 2013, also by Germans. There's this expression from ecology that you can find the antidote near the poison. Isn't that true with Germany? They did a study finding the same thing for the impacts of renewables on wildlife. They're doing really good research. This is a study of how much energy is returned on energy invested. So this is not a financial study. This is a physical analysis of different energy sources. And what buffered and unbuffered means is what's the return on energy when you account for the storage needs of that technology. So if you have to store the technology, that's the yellow bar. It's a little bit lower return on investment for most technologies except for nuclear. You can see that for our high energy civilization to survive, we need to produce an 8-to-1 energy return on energy invested ratio. Solar does not reach those levels. Biomass does not reach those levels. Wind does not reach those levels when you account for storage. But look at hydro and nuclear. No wonder Sweden, which produces 40% of its electricity from hydro and 40% from nuclear, is so cheap and so carbon-free. None of this would shock any of the historians of energy who have been writing these studies. They've now proven, there's both a British study by a Cambridge professor and a beautiful study by Rudolf Sieferle, the German historian, naturally, The Subterranean Forest, one of the most beautiful books ever written on energy, where they show through physical calculations that the Industrial Revolution could not have happened with wood. People back then, they knew that they couldn't create the Industrial Revolution with wood, but they've now shown for physical reasons. It wasn't like they didn't work hard enough back then. Wood just did not produce enough heat energy to be able to power the machines that gave rise to the Industrial Revolution. Did solar become so cheap? It certainly did, no doubt about it. Solar panels became very, very cheap. Was it because the solar panels improved the efficiency with which sunlight was converted into electricity? The answer would be no. Solar panel efficiencies increased just 3% over the last decade. I'm using the standard solar panel, the basic polysilicon solar panel, which Bell Labs invented in the 1950s and which the Chinese are making in these gigantic factories. That's not why solar panels became so cheap. Why did solar panels become so cheap? Kind of awkward. Kind of an awkward subject, but both the Bundestag research group and the U.S. State Department say that what the Chinese are doing to the Uyghur Muslim minority is should be called genocide. Every time I say this, somebody on Twitter says it's not genocide. Okay, well, you find some other word for the horrible treatment of the Uyghur Muslims, fine, but it's not great to go put hundreds of thousands of people into internment camps and then say, well, if you would like to have a job, you can go work at the solar panel factory. Not great. What about the waste? With nuclear, the cost of managing the waste in perpetuity is built into the cost that you pay for electricity. This is what economists love this. This is called internalizing your externalities. This is the obsession of neoclassical environmental economists. Solar doesn't do that at all. And yet the solar advocates will talk about how nuclear supposedly externalizes its waste products. Fossil fuels, which do externalize waste products, solar panels externalize their waste product, meaning there is no solution to the solar panel waste. It's all going to be dumped on African countries, or it's going to go to landfills. If you actually did internalize the costs, this is according to one study published in Harvard Business Review, it would increase the cost of of the electricity fourfold from what it is now. The economics of solar, wrote this team of business school folks from INSEAD, will darken quickly as the industry sinks under the weight of its own trash. By the way, I wrote one of the first stories on solar waste, and I was accused of trolling. Is that a word that translates? I was accused of trolling, which, to be fair, I was a little bit. But I was accused of trolling everybody in 2019. 1 year later, the New York Times did the exact same story, but they did it better because it's the New York Times and I'm just a dude writing for Forbes. Went to Africa and found the communities where the solar panels at the end of the life were being generously donated by Europeans to be used, but they have no waste disposal system for it, and they often end up smashing open their electronic waste to get at the valuable metals inside. Nuclear is scary, but every major study finds, the graphic's not quite showing up, but every major study finds that nuclear is already the safest way to make reliable electricity. What about Chernobyl? That was the worst accident of all times from nuclear. It was absolutely terrible. Everything went wrong. The reactor exploded and then it was on fire. It was a complete nightmare. Killed about 50 people. And then if you count all the thyroid deaths, thyroid cancers are the only cancers that we can detect any increase in. Another 150 deaths or so over the next 80 years. It's not great. Nobody wants Chernobyl, but as far as energy accidents go, the Banqiao Dam collapsed and killed 250,000 people in China, just to put it in perspective. Natural gas pipelines explode and they kill 12 people. 7 million people see their lives shortened annually from air pollution. My friend, the climate scientist James Hansen, calculates that nuclear has already saved 2 million lives just by preventing the burning of fossil fuels. What about the waste? It's the best kind of waste. It's not actually waste. That's part of it. All of the magical nuclear goodness is still inside the so-called waste. 98% of the energy is left over to be used by future humans in fast reactors that will burn up all of that so-called waste byproduct. But for now, it just sits on a basketball court in Switzerland. It's fine. If you think it needs to be buried, then you're in the grip of a superstitious religion. Why else would you want to bury it? I'm an anthropologist. Why do we bury things? Because we think they're dead, and we're trying to return them to the underworld. That's the only explanation. Nuclear engineers have no idea that they're in the grip of a superstitious religion, plus they get paid a lot of money to try to bury it underground. The Finns wanted to explain to me this elaborate, complicated system for returning the nuclear waste to the underworld. It was amazing. I was interested strictly anthropologically. There's no reason to do this. People say, what about if it leaks? What do you think it is? You think it's liquid? I mean, I did, because I got my information from The Simpsons. It was green liquid in The Simpsons. What's a kid to think? Turns out it's very boring black metal fuel rods. That's all it is. It's in cement and concrete. The people that put it in those canisters overcharged for it, because you can overcharge people that are in the grip of a religion. The nuclear industry is part of the problem, naturally. But nonetheless, if it were up to me, everybody would just have a couple basketball courts. In the Netherlands, they do the best job. I should have included it here. They store their nuclear waste with their valuable tapestries inside a gigantic orange building with the words E = MC squared on it. They have cocktail parties. I kid you not. They have people drinking the Dutch, because they're Dutch. They're cool. They drink champagne and cheese and nuclear waste right next to them, and ancient tapestries hanging on the walls, because they both like the same cave-cooled conditions. I love the Dutch. Is climate activism working? A lot of us thought it was ridiculous to think that shareholder activism would have any impact on what investors did. And it maybe isn't as big of an impact as it appears to be, but according to the Financial Times, environmental ESG, environmental, social, and governance considerations account for much of the decline in the capital expenditure by international oil companies in recent years and the investor exodus out of oil and gas markets. Well, isn't this just a market response? For sure, it was a market response after 2010 when you can see the price of oil declines. Why would you invest then in expanded production? There's too much supply. But then you can see oil prices start to go up, again, before the pandemic, but you did not see a corresponding increase in investment. Well, isn't that good because oil and gas are bad? Well, no, because now we're going to burn more coal in the United States for the first time since 2014. Europe is returning to coal in a big way. China reopened its coal mines in a big way, waiving environmental safeguards because they didn't have enough natural gas. Well, okay, Shellenberger, but maybe it's good because then we'll use less petroleum. Well, it turns out that petroleum is highly inelastic, to use another fancy economics word, meaning that for the most part, you just use the amount of petroleum you're going to use because you have to drive to go to work, you have to use your car, you have to use your vehicles. So making petroleum more expensive mostly just reduces human welfare. Now it's embarrassing President Biden. He's in this really sad position where he has to beg OPEC to produce more foreign oil. It's not a good look for President Biden or for Democrats. Gasoline prices are rising very significantly in the United States, despite the fact that we have abundant shale reserves. Well, nonetheless, this is all great news for nuclear. Those of us that are big nuclear proponents, I've coined a new German word because I know zero German, but I've coined a new word. It's called Energiewende Schadenfreude. And it's what I have. I have Energiewende Schadenfreude, which is me taking pleasure in the failure of the Energiewende. And I'm not embarrassed about it at all. And now the new king of Europe is Emmanuel Macron. Look how happy he is. Boris Johnson, he says he's going back to nuclear too. The new Japanese prime minister won the power struggle within his own party on the issue of nuclear. So nuclear went from being the biggest loser 10 years ago to being the biggest winner. Macron is the leader of Europe. Angela Merkel's out. Nobody even knows the name of the new chancellor of Germany, not outside of Germany, maybe not outside of Europe, but we all know who Emmanuel Macron is. He's cute as a button. He's going to do a bunch of nuclear. He produced the best piece of pro-nuclear propaganda I've seen. It's on Twitter. It's called La Rêve Possible, and it's astonishing. It's beautiful. It's what we've been encouraging the nuclear industry to be doing for the last 10 years. It shows French scientific and technical greatness. It even has a little archival footage of Marie Curie, the mother of nuclear, the humanitarian, the double Nobel Prize winner, the person who, after winning her Nobel Prizes and World War I breaks out, says, I'm going to use radiation for the benefit of humankind. We're going to create little Petit Curies, little mobile hospitals to treat gunshot wounds with radiation. This is what nuclear is. It's healing. It's the only technology that can lead to a truly sustainable world and shrink the environmental footprint. We should stop this thing of trying to create many fancy new designs. Nuclear wants to be boring. It wants to be big. It wants to be high pressure. It wants to be standardized. It wants to be old, not new. It wants to look like this. These are the senior construction managers I interviewed in South Korea. Here they are looking fondly over their children, the new APR 1400s, which they scaled up from 1,000 megawatts to 1,400 megawatts. Ugh. Beautiful marvels. They paint birds on the sides of the reactor domes. I asked him, I said, these two guys, they've worked together for almost 30 years each. I said, when you interview nuclear engineers in the United States and you ask about the technology, they say, oh, it's totally different. We've changed everything. That should frighten you. I said to these guys, I go, what's different about the two reactors? They wouldn't let me take a picture of them because they think it's some super national security secret or something. But I was like, China's taking photographs from space. But nonetheless, right here, they're building two new reactors. We fought to keep them, maintain the construction even after an anti-nuclear president was elected. I said, what's different? What did you change? Nothing. We didn't change anything. Come on, guys. Something must have changed. He thought about it. He said, we're using more of the small cranes, the little yellow cranes. That's it. It's a source of pride. They don't change it, but they go 40% larger. Everybody is in love with small modular reactors. The main reason is that they don't exist, so nothing can go wrong with them. It's like your fantasy girlfriend, boyfriend. They're absolutely perfect. They're way better than the person you're with right now because they don't exist. But the nuclear reactors that they've been scaling up are 40% larger, so they're going to produce 40% more electricity, 40% cheaper, without a significant increase in the workforce, either to build the plants, manage them, or regulate them. That's what nuclear wants to be. It wants to be big and boring. It wants to have exciting public relations, like Emmanuel Macron's La Rêve Possible. But it doesn't want the technology to be boring. So you have to rein in the over-enthusiastic nuclear engineering boys. This is how nuclear becomes efficient, by making huge mistakes. You can see 3 Mile Island was one of the best things that ever happened in nuclear power in 1979. The engineers were so arrogant before that. But look, so, pride cometh before a fall. And then 3 Mile Island happens. They were licking their wounds, and they said, okay, guys, we better get better at what we call human factors. That's the humans, because nuclear is actually humans. If I say nuclear to most people, they think of a mushroom cloud, or at best they might think of a nuclear power plant or a control room panel. We should think of people, because nuclear is people, and people require training, they require standardization, they require love and care from the society. That's how you get the efficiency levels to go up. So the nuclear reactors went from running half the year to running over 90% of the year. It makes them very efficient. Unfortunately, we're basically ceding the world of nuclear to the Chinese and the Russians. Nuclear, because it's a dual-use technology. Nobody likes it when I say that, but it is. That's not a great thing for national security. I've interviewed Republican and Democratic national security experts and said, hey, is it a good idea that we've now let Saudi Arabia work with China to build nuclear plants and uranium enrichment facilities? I haven't found anybody that thinks that's a good idea. And nobody likes Saudi Arabia, but nobody thinks that China should be doing it. We should be doing it, not Xi or Putin. So we've built this really beautiful movement to save nuclear power. We protest. We're trying to save California's last nuclear power plant, finally getting some recognition from mainstream media sources, which point out that nuclear is beautiful. It's the Cinderella of energy. Its evil stepsisters, solar and wind and fossil fuels, have said that nuclear is dirty, but it's not. It's the cleanest. It's the best. And we know that it's the best because it, just like with Cinderella, we know she was the princess because her footprint, and the nuclear footprint is so small, so perfect. That's how we know nuclear is a Cinderella story. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you.
We will take it to the floor, but I'll just ask you one question. It's a great book, and part of what's great about it is that you've built in stories, real life stories of people out in the world. You've traveled a lot, so I would like you to talk a little bit about Bernadette and Supati, some of the main characters in your book. Would that be okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Apocalypse Never is, I sort of hide the pill in the dog food in Apocalypse Never. Do you have that expression? It's an environmental textbook, actually. But you're going to make the medicine go down through little stories. The 3 main characters are Bernadette, Supati, and my wife, Helen. And I use them to illustrate how our energy and food consumption and production changes over time. Bernadette is a small farmer in the Congo. When I met her, the baboons had just eaten her sweet potatoes. The rebel forces were threatening to kill her husband. She's on the run. She's in a state of war. Her problems, the last of her problems, are climate change. She's trying to survive. She's got terrible governance in the Congo. She produces all of her own food and energy. She collects her own wood. It's very material intensive. It's a very short, brutal life. I then described the story of Supati. She's a factory worker in Indonesia. She cooks with liquefied petroleum gas, which is much better than cooking with wood. You would think that women and children that cook with wood would complain about the wood smoke, and sometimes they do, but mostly they complain about how much work it is to have to go collect biomass, and then you have to fan the fire just to cook a small pot of beans. When Bernadette or others, Bernadette's too poor to afford it, but when you get a little bit of money in sub-Saharan Africa, you buy a piece of charcoal, and because you can put the charcoal under the pot of beans, and then you can go and do something else like clean your house or wash the clothes. But for Suparti, she can come home from work and turn on the liquefied petroleum gas in the same way we use natural gas here. And she had, when I met her, she was 22. She had a motor scooter, 2 smartphones. She was buying a house. It was a hard job for sure. Working in the factory is hard, but it was much better than working on the farm. She was able to choose who she was going to marry. She had a bunch of suitors hitting on her when I was there. And it wasn't an arranged marriage, so she had a degree of liberation. And my wife and I were completely spoiled. We sit there and we order food on our phones. My wife has a garden in the back, but of course we can't rely on the food from our garden. That's ridiculous. We would die. Our food is from large hydroelectric dams and nuclear power plants and industrialized agriculture, shipped in from all over the world. There's no reason to think that everybody, that Bernadette couldn't live and that Suparti couldn't live the lives that Helen and I enjoy. I point out that I think economists and others have been too quick to dismiss the notion that poor countries will get rich in the same way we did, which is through manufacturing primarily. It's true that manufacturing is a smaller share of the economy for developing economies. The share of the workforce and the share of the economy for manufacturing in places like Vietnam peaks at lower levels than it did in Britain and Europe. But nonetheless, when you go to places like Ethiopia, and they are also developing in the same ways we did. They dam the rivers. They have cheap power. People move to the city. They get jobs in the factories, and they make products for export. That model is the only model we know, other than being Saudi Arabia and having a lot of oil, or Norway. That's the only model we know about how to integrate small farmers into the modern economy to become proletariat. The same process that Karl Marx described and praised 150 years ago. And I think we need to remind ourselves of that, because there's so many people that think that that poor countries are gonna get rich by giving them things through charity or by development aid, and it's just not gonna work that way.
Thank you. We'll take it to the floor now, and I'll tell the people online, there's about 50 of you. You're welcome to put in a question in the chat, and I'll look at it occasionally, and if there is one and I like the question, I'll read it out. Okay. Please present yourself and ask a brief question. A question is something that ends with a question mark.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. My name is Freddy Jacobsen. I'm an engineer. And I'm very interested in the next slide you're going to make, and that would be the new type of nuclear factories, where they are maybe using melted salt to burn away the previous debris.
Sure. I love that idea. I became pro-nuclear with this idea that we would sort of mass manufacture nuclear reactors like the way we make smartphones. It sounds great. I think we're a ways away from it, which is why I've made some effort to highlight what the Koreans have done for the near term. I'm open to being more inclusive of what we call the advanced nuclear vision. If I saw more effort to really reaffirm the role of big, boring, standardized water-cooled reactor in the short terms. But yes, there have been various designs proposed. I'm working on a new book right now about nuclear. Apocalypse Never started as a book about nuclear. I abandoned that, or I expanded it rather, in 2019 when Greta Thunberg started scaring all of my daughter's friends, and felt the need to push back on that. But I did.
But not your daughters?
My daughter's fine. Yeah, she has to listen to her dad, poor girl. But I am working on a book about nuclear because we still don't have our heads screwed on right about that technology. She's a very difficult technology. Nuclear is young, not old, very young. Nuclear is a radical event in human history. It's as though fossil fuels and gunpowder were invented at the same time in the same process. We still don't understand what nuclear is at a fundamental level, so I'm working on a book about that. We'll get into more of it, but I do believe that we will have this different kind of nuclear someday, but I also think we'll have different jet planes one day. I think we'll have jet planes that are powered by hydrogen, and they'll be able to get me from San Francisco to Sydney, Australia in an hour. They'll be like rockets. Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are probably pioneering them right now in a certain sense. But we should still build jet planes because we still need jet planes, and we still need the big old water-cooled nuclear plants. There's definitely candidates that are all very interesting. There's, if you read the history of nuclear technologies, they were initially very excited about the sodium fast reactors. That was what the United States had been invested in. The Russians have it. The Russians are actually demonstrating it right now. They're way ahead of us. If somebody wanted that technology, they would get it from the Russians. The Hungarians think that they're going to do that. Bill Gates and others have been attracted towards using a chemical salt, usually lithium or beryllium or some fluoride mixture, where it would be impossible to have a meltdown because it would be a liquid fuel coolant combination. That's often called a molten salt reactor. It's sometimes misnamed a molten salt thorium reactor, even though it could run on uranium, and thorium offers no benefits other than not being called uranium, as far as I can tell. I'm open to any of those. I think if you have a serious nuclear build out, you would have advanced nuclear in the same way that if you have a serious aerospace industry, you would have advanced jet planes. What I object to is the making the perfect the enemy of the good.
So you're objecting to the idea that we need a different kind of nuclear technology to scale it up.
Yeah.
You're saying that the current technology we have is perfect. We're not talking
not perfect, but yeah,
is perfectly usable for that purpose.
Yeah, I mean, look at the French. I mean, the French are fine. I mean, the French also made the same mistake, which was changing their technology. I love the Korean model. They got better at making these big 1,400 megawatt water-cooled nuclear reactors. They add they use more small cranes, but we could be at 70-80% of nuclear. Really, everybody could, and it's standardized. You'd have construction crews around the world. I mean, it makes me actually sad to think about these old Korean guys. Not. They're going to retire, and I'm worried that they don't have the next generation coming up that's going to have that ability. The United States has something. This was based on a Westinghouse, but the United States said that wasn't good enough. We created something called the AP1000, advanced pressurized water with a back of water coolant above the reactor in case there was a power outage. Then the water could still cool it for 3 days. I just don't buy it. I don't think that you needed to do that, but we built 2 of them in Georgia, and now we're not going to build it. We're supposedly not going to build it anymore. So we spent blood, sweat, and tears building these 2 reactors way over budget. And now that all that expertise, all the human expertise is lost to the wind. It breaks my heart. So the French are now pursuing, the French have abandoned their Westinghouse modified pressurized water reactor for their EPR. It is getting built. It's been a complete nightmare in Olkiluoto, Finland, in Flamanville, France, in Hinkley Point C in Britain. But it does appear that they're going to do another one in Sizewell. And so for me, I would think if I were a European nation, I would go French and just build more of those EPRs. And you would insist as a policymaker that I would want to know that the guys the guys who shed all the blood, sweat, and tears were involved in building my reactors, because they learned the hard way how to do it.
These stories are an illustration why we don't want a world government, isn't it? I mean, if we go astray in the West, there's always someone out there who keeps the technology going, the South Koreans, and show us by the force of example what can be done, and then we can move back to the righteous path.
It's also a story of scarcity having all sorts of hidden benefits. The Chinese were so rich, and sort of one of the problems of that decadence is that they had so many different designs that they pioneered. The Chinese were like, we'll just build them all because we're China. We're China. The Koreans had this really clear focus, and so the Koreans won a big reactor construction project in United Arab Emirates, completed nearly on time, nearly on budget, really remarkable. But they got that because they had that focus, and I think that's one of the things we get from them.
Okay.
Thank you. My name is Mads Vestergaard. Thank you for a very interesting speech as well. I have a question regarding waste. You went a bit over that with what they did in Switzerland, actually.
Yeah.
My question is, what are we actually doing in the major countries with waste? I mean, like France, Russia, the US, and China. When I was young, I wrote a paper on nuclear power and the discussion about that in Denmark, and it ended in the early 80s or mid 80s. And at that time, it ended with we didn't know what to do with the long-term storage of nuclear. So where are we actually now in middle term and long term? Sorry if it's a bit unclear question.
No.
You're still young.
Well, so the United States basically does this, except for we have our canisters outside at the nuclear plant, at the site of production. I love that because when you know from your environmental studies class that the way to create a circular economy is that you would internalize the waste byproduct at the site of production, so you're not externalizing it into the environment. So then the question comes, well, what about in the year 2100 or 2200? What's going to happen with the nuclear waste? Well, my first response to that is, who cares? Who cares? No, you don't care about that. Like, what other thing in our society are you worried about how the people in 2100 are going to deal with it? It's absurd. Okay, fine, we care a little bit, so let's go there. We could either reuse the waste, or we could just keep it where it is now. So that gives people anxiety. Why? People go, well, so then it's just going to sit there. What are you worried about? I guess that's my question is, what are we worried about? It's just going to sit there. We're not worried about all these other things that will just sit around as waste byproducts. What about the solar panels? What's the long-term waste disposal plan for solar panels? How come we're not talking about that? Because we don't associate it with nuclear weapons, probably. Because we think that the funniest, weirdest thing is, I don't know if you've seen this, where whenever people talk about these long-term waste repositories where we return the waste to the underworld, to the gods of the underworld, they say we have to create special markings above ground to communicate to future beings that there's dangerous things underground. My questions are, first of all, who are these future beings? Do you know something we don't? The United States is obsessed with UFOs right now. So are we talking about aliens? Because please share the information. If they're talking about humans, then it's kind of, well, are we going somewhere? Do we anticipate not being able to speak the languages we speak anymore? It's the most bizarre thing. We have to find a way to communicate dangerous things being below ground in some language than we already have. I mean, we're reading ancient Sanskrit. Like, what are we like? We're worried that people in 2500 aren't going to be able to read English? I don't, so you're clearly in the realm of the mythological at that point, right? I mean, they have these weird designs, dangerous things underground. That looks more like a religious sculpture, some sort of a totem or something. I haven't fully figured it out. So I think you have to kind of go, what's the real world practical solution to waste? It's what we already do now. Are we going to ever use the waste in the future? Future humans, they might decide to, but that's up to them. We have nothing to do with that. So then you're stuck with a public relations problem. And so for me, the French, who, of course, because they're French, they do the best psychological and anthropological analyses of this. And what they discover, what is reassuring to people, is to say, well, the scientists are going to continue to study it, and they're going to look at it, and they're going to work with it. It's almost like sourdough. You have sourdough here, right? So you kind of go, it's like sourdough. We're going to keep kind of feeding it, and it's alive. It's like cheese. Nuclear waste, it's like cheese. It's beautiful. It's alive. It's going to help us in the future. It's like little spirit beings or something. I mean, if you have to attach ridiculous, irrational meanings to nuclear waste products, let's let them be positive.
My name is Nicholas Clark. I read your book and great presentation, so thanks for that. I have a finance background, and in finance, the investment approach du jour is called ESG. You touched on it briefly, and this is about not just focusing on fiduciary duties, but also allocating funds for the quote-unquote greater good. So my specific question is, why is nuclear energy not an ESG priority for asset managers?
Oh, you tell me. No, you must know more. No, give him back the mic. You tell me why is nuclear not an ESG priority?
Okay.
Yeah, Go ahead.
I think that there's too much emotion and not enough rationality.
Okay, sorry. Go on.
I think the world was a more rational place, and people could have an opportunity to explain complicated ways in more than a 30-second soundbite. Then perhaps we could have a debate that was more fact-based and more rational, as opposed to emotionally laden.
Can BlackRock make as much money off of nuclear plants as it can from selling Chinese solar panels in project finance?
Good question.
I don't think so. So BlackRock got in trouble for manipulating its ESG criteria by the European Commission. I've written about it. Other people have written about it. It's maybe one of the least reported stories out there. Because the first question is I just went through all of the ESG criteria, right? I mean, that's what I did. I just went through the ESG criteria on material throughput, on waste, on pollution. Nuclear outperforms solar. So why is solar considered high? Why is it so highly ranked from ESG perspective, and nuclear is completely dismissed? Well, when you look at the reports, what they end up saying is they go, well, nuclear has some sort of a relationship with nuclear weapons. So they give a spiritual reason, right? They give a religious, irrational reason for this. It's obviously doesn't have anything to do with the environment, not in the ways at least we conventionally understand the environment. In terms of social impacts, anything that uses 300 to 400 times more land is going to have bigger social impacts. Full stop. Anytime you're pulling tortoises out of their burrows, you're going to have much bigger wildlife impacts. So, and governance impacts too. So for me, I think, since you wrote Apocalypse Never, I think there's 3 factors behind apocalyptic environmentalism: money, power, religion. So I basically agree with you. There is people sometimes say to me, Michael, nuclear requires socialism. See, look at Sweden and France. It's not true, actually. America's not a socialist society, and our utilities are mostly privately owned, 2/3 privately owned. But the way they financed nuclear plant was with boring capital. I'm also in favor of boring banks. I like boring banks. I like boring nuclear. Exciting marketing, but boring finance. So what they're proposing, what EDF France is proposing to do with the British government is called the Rab Model. Someone will have to remind me what the RAB stands for. Is it regulated asset base, which is basically using slow capital, pension funds, mostly people that want a high security of return, but they know they're going to get a lower interest rate on financing nuclear plants. It's basically as good as using public capital. So that's what I think we should be pushing on. I'm very excited to work with folks in the finance community to push back against the BlackRock-led. Look, Uyghur Muslims, Chinese, your labor force is coming from internment camps, and that passed your governance criteria? It's a scandal. I am going to write about that too in the next book. But yeah, we need people in the financial sector to be pushing back against this noxious ESG criteria.
And also there's no consistent, agreed upon, well-defined taxonomy for classifying classification criteria.
And you probably know that the EU, there's a big battle over whether or not nuclear is classified as green at the EU level. And you've got the European nations all lined up against each other with Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Denmark. I'm going to resist making a really inappropriate joke. Lined up against France, Hungary, Slovenia, and others on this issue of nuclear. But I think Angela Merkel today just said, or yesterday said, that she thinks that the taxonomy will include nuclear, which is great news. So the energy crisis has come just at the right moment.
Okay, we're going to take a question here.
My name is Henrik Auden. I'm an economist and business entrepreneur. When I read my Danish newspapers, and it's exactly the same when I read my international newspapers, it always says that 97% of all scientists believe that global heating is caused by human beings, because every year we increase the amount of CO2 that we emit, and therefore we should spend huge amounts of money cutting this back. What is your view on this?
Well, as you can probably tell, I tend to believe that the accumulation of carbon dioxide is responsible for the warming. I have friends that think that it's not responsible for all the warming, but we know that carbon dioxide is a heat-trapping molecule. So I do tend to agree with the basic climate science on that issue. But I agree that it's been completely abused to suggest that 97% of all climate scientists also say, for example, that hurricanes or that natural disasters are getting worse. It's been completely abused. And you're right that the media coverage of this has been nothing short of theological in its one-sided presentation of all this. It's been very hard to get the mainstream news media. We see a phenomenon in the United States, but also in Europe, where it's mainstream newspaper journalists demanding that voices, that dissident voices like Bjorn Lomborg, like Michael Shellenberger, like Roger Pielke, not be put in the newspapers. And it's emerging from the alarmist public itself. When I would write op-eds for the New York Times, people would write into the New York Times to complain. Readers would write in to complain. Why are you subjecting us to this horrible diversity of opinion? Don't you know we want to be told the same goddamn thing over and over again? It makes us feel better about ourselves. We just had a conversation about this. Martin is doing important work with his podcast, and CEPOS is obviously able to communicate to an audience outside of traditional channels. We are I think we're in a renaissance of new media right now. As an author, I have my second book came out a couple of weeks ago about crime, drugs, and homelessness in California and other states. And it's a pleasure to have these podcasts. We have 3 hours of podcast conversation. Martin and I are going to do a podcast tomorrow. We have Substack, which is basically people can write articles that's sent out over email, and they can avoid the censors at Facebook. Both Bjorn Lomborg and I are being censored by Facebook right now. It's completely appalling. On the other hand, we haven't been censored by Twitter. Twitter's been less authoritarian in their mentality on this. So I think that, the cracks are where the sunlight is let in, and so there are cracks in the machine. We met with a couple of journalists today that I believe write for the biggest Danish newspaper that have been able to communicate minority views. But I share your frustration. The media has been grossly irresponsible on this. And all I can say is that when people do hear new information and it comes as a surprise to them, they want to learn more. I tweeted the other day, I'm sorry, I should have put it in here. You can find it on my Twitter page. I tweeted a video that the Chinese government, because they're the worst marketers in the world of their own products, they shot a video of this horrible looking solar farm on these green hillsides in China. They were promoting it, and it's just like this, like a nightmarish. It looks like a cancer spraying across, God's green earth. And I tweeted it out, and it's been retweeted something like 6,000 times, and 2.5 million people have seen it. And the response from everybody is like, we had no idea that that's what the impacts of solar panels were on landscapes, other than making it into an occasional Blade Runner film. People, people don't know what solar panels do. They've just seen the propaganda. So I think the flip side, everything bad has a good side, and I think the good side of it is that there's real hunger and interest and desire for accurate information.
Speaking of podcasts, you've been on Joe Rogan's podcast, and you've been on Jordan B. Peterson's podcast, and tomorrow you're on my podcast. So that's
only going up.
There's an online question here. One of the climate change arguments I hear is that the desert regions around the world will expand as global temperatures increase. Is there any evidence of this? And it's Johan Lassen asking that question.
Boy, that's a really good question. I haven't actually looked at that science of desertification, so somebody else may know the answer to it. But what we do know is that we're not doomed to desertification, because if we were, the Chinese wouldn't be constructing what they call the Great Green Wall. The Chinese are actively reforesting previously desert regions. So we do have the capacity to expand forests. And obviously I looked at this overall reforestation, but I don't know what the science is on increased desertification. Does anybody else know that? Thank you for asking. I'll have to find that out and
I think Lomborg writes about it in his book.
And what does he say?
It's too long ago. I read, quoting something like that from memory is not safe.
Yeah.
It's a controversial issue. So let's look it up. But I mean, in general,
the planet's greening.
To talk about this,
so,
exactly. In general, the planet is greening, and
right.
you had some pictures on that. And also, I mean, looking at what climate economists are actually estimating are the costs of global warming. Could you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I don't have the exact numbers, and and Bjorn does the cost-benefit analysis better than I do, but I just don't have them, and I didn't put it in here, and in part because
But I think your food example is a very good illustration of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, I believe it's something like I want to say something like the Nordhaus model is like 4% less wealth in 2100. Is that right? Okay.
I think it's about 2 actually.
2%.
2% less. If we have a 3-degree temperature increase, wealth will be 2% lower. So that's
2% lower GDP.
1 year's increase in GDP.
Yeah.
That's
so it's trivial.
which is quite a lot. You should deal with that. But the issue, of course, is it's not the end of the world.
And also, I think what you're keeping in mind is that we're significantly wealthier in 2100 than we are today.
4 times as wealthy.
Yeah. So I did cite Nordhaus because you kind of have to do that if you're going to write a book about climate change. But what I wanted to do in Apocalypse Never was to help people to see the actual insides of what those cost-benefit analyses are constructed on. So that's why I went into why we're expecting to see much greater agricultural yields, why we're expected to see much greater overall wealth, because I think that helps people to unpack some of that. There's my concern with the cost-benefit analysis. Sometimes I think the public hears it as, trust us, we've run the numbers and it's all going to be fine. And I think people need to understand what things being fine looks like on the ground. And that's why I preferred to tell the story of Bernadette and of Supartie and Helen, to give people that sense of a human view as to why things are going to get better and how.
Right. Okay. We'll take a few more questions, and now we'll take 2 in a row. We have 2 people sitting next to each other. They both want to ask questions.
Hello, my name is Rebecca. Thank you for the talk, Michael. We know each other already. For the rest of the people in the room, I'd like to hear from you. Which way would you approach people, like mainly on the street, in a jiffy, who are opposed to nuclear? What is the best thing to say to them?
That was the first question. Now the second.
Sure.
My name is Søren. Thank you very much for a great presentation. I think it's extremely common to sort of hear about this environmental alarmism, and I keep being puzzled by sort of like what exactly are we so afraid of? And I was wondering sort of if you could speak to why you think it's so widespread. And then, like, I can't help myself thinking that we somehow randomly said that there's a target of 1.5 degrees, and that's completely unrealistic. And then now that we are not like hitting that target, we're like, oh, we're not hitting the target. Jesus Christ. So on like why we have so much climate alarmism.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, I mentioned before, Apocalypse Never really looks at 3 factors. I mean, on the one hand, it's just simple that people have been fed a lot of misinformation about this, so at the most basic level, people just don't know any of the things that I've described in these slides. They're just completely ignorant. And so I wanted to write Apocalypse Never to just debunk the popular myths. That's the first third of the book. The second third of the book is about how humans actually do save nature while lifting ourselves out of poverty. So I describe the most simple process of people no longer needing to farm because we become more productive, and then moving to cities and getting jobs often in factories or things related to city life, and that allowing marginal farmlands to return to grasslands and forests, and people to understand that process of what used to be called ecological modernization. But the third is that obviously these facts have been out there and they've been ignored. I don't think the explanation is, it's not just, you can't just sort of say, I'm not, the information I'm producing in that first third of Apocalypse Never is information that is available to everybody in the IPCC reports themselves, if you bother to read them, or other scientific reports. So why do we ignore them? Well, I mentioned financial interests. There's very powerful financial interests that have a stake in selling solar panels and wind turbines. For example, those financial interests have been involved in actually attacking nuclear energy. In part, I argue, because if you have nuclear energy, you don't have to do all these bizarre things that people want to do in the name of climate change. I once wrote an article called The Reason They Hate Nuclear is Because It Means We Don't Need Renewables. If there's nuclear power, there's no climate crisis. What a drag. They want the climate crisis, right? So the second part is power. There's clearly something going on where people seeking social and cultural and political power use alarmism. If you go back to and you look at what was going on in the 60s, you saw, in fact, very identical type characters as Greta Thunberg raising the alarm about overpopulation, too many people. young women in college saying that they weren't going to have kids to deal with this overpopulation problem of too many people. Very similar kinds of alarmism. Very similar kinds of alarmism around nuclear weapons, which genuinely I think are much scarier than either overpopulation was or climate change is, but nonetheless very similar kind of cultural formation where people that are feeling low status or insecure are using alarmism to become high status. I mean, just look at the experience of Greta. She's being bombarded with catastrophic environmental messages from the time she's a child until she's a teenager. She says, according to her own account, she becomes very depressed, and she escapes her depression by gaining social rewards, positive feedback, positive strokes from the adults around her for being an alarmist. She was rewarded for it. And of course, it made her feel happier. So she escaped her depression by making everybody around her depressed. That's just basic Friedrich Nietzsche right there. So
a zero-sum game, eh?
Yeah. We see Prince Harry and Meghan Markle flying private jets to and from climate change conferences in 2019. Well, okay, Elton John bought carbon offsets, so he bought indulgences from the Church of Climate Change to pay for his friends' sins. But then they did it again in September. They flew private back from a climate conference in New York. And Marie Claire, which is a sort of a women's magazine, and the tabloids went crazy. And you have to be like, did they not know that they were going to be criticized for flying private jets to a climate change conference? Of course they knew. I mean, they might be dumb, but they're not that dumb. So they knew they were going to be criticized. So my theory is, if you're feeling insecure, as Harry and Meghan have plainly felt, if you listen to what they say, they left their royalty or whatever, they would rather be accused of being elitists, because at least that reaffirms their status as elites, than to be ignored. So there's something there about being a hypocrite is a way of showing that you follow different rules than the commoners do. So there's a power game at work for sure. And if you agree with the social psychologists, power and status is our main motivation. That's the main reason we do what we do, is to gain social status. That's according to psychologists. And then the last part is religion. Nietzsche writes in the late 19th century, this is not controversial, that people are not behaving as though they really believe in God anymore. You might go to church, but you don't really think God is looking at what you're doing every day and making a little tally to decide whether or not you get into heaven. Nobody's really behaving that way. This is what Nietzsche observes in the 19th century, but now we see secularization as a very well-studied phenomenon among sociologists. Northern Europeans are, I think, the least believer of any people in the world. It's like 90% consider themselves atheists. And so the idea is that the fear of death, the idea that your life is really meaningless, there's no point to it. That's the main message from the scientific community. Of course, we have no proof, but nonetheless, that's the main story that a lot of people don't want to believe that their lives are worthless and there's no point to it. They want to have what psychologists call an Immortality Project, some sense that what they're doing has some impact on the world beyond their own trivial lives. And so we seek to give our lives meaning by changing the world in some way, by playing a Marvel superhero, saving the planet from destruction. To some extent, it's a healthy phase of human development. Jordan Peterson describes the messianic complex as a healthy phase of adolescent development, but you're supposed to eventually phase out of that. And in our increasingly adolescent culture, it takes us a long time to phase out of it. People that are suffering from that insecurity and anomie then gravitate towards that new religion. It's striking the similarities. There's an original sin, the use of fossil fuels in the Industrial Revolution. There's a belief in the supernatural. Everything that happens must be because of climate change. There's a flood. It must have been from climate change. Even though on the buildings in your old Europe, you can see 1654, the water came up to here. 1585, the water came up to here. Oh no, it's never happened before. So it's a supernatural belief. And so you see the guilt, the sense that somehow we're responsible for the destruction of nature by people in the past, that is some burden that we still hold. There appears to be some desire amongst some amount of secular people to have this religious belief, and climate change has become the dominant secular religion in the West. Oh, and then nuclear. Rebecca, sorry, one more thing.
Yeah.
Rebecca and I have known each other for 5 years. Rebecca was one of the first pro-nuclear advocates that we knew in Europe, and it's been a lovely a lovely 5 years. We've come a long way in those 5 years. We were very few of us that got together in 2017 in Amsterdam together. You were there. And so it's lovely to see you again. And my first time in Copenhagen, we've been talking about me being here. So thank you for asking that question. Well, you know what I think because I've given these TED Talks on it. I think it's important to start soft with people and to not be scary and threatening. It's important to deal with people's concerns right away. The taboo within the pro-nuclear community, by which I include the scientific and technical community, but also the industry, the taboo has don't talk about nuclear weapons. And I got into so much trouble because as soon as anybody says something, whenever people tell me what not to do, I became very interested in it. The people don't talk about nuclear weapons. Why is that? That became very interesting to me. So there's been some sense, but of course that's what a lot of people are concerned about. I'm not saying it's everything. A lot of people still genuinely worry about radiation and Chernobyl and the waste, but I just think these are theological concerns. I mean, just look at it. It's ridiculous. There's no devils or witches there. It's just a bunch of boring metal fuel rods. But I think surfacing the irrational is a psychotherapeutic technique, right? That's what we do in psychotherapy is we say, maybe what you're concerned about is you're not happy with who you're married to, or maybe you feel like you're stuck in a bad job. Maybe that's what's going on. Oh my God, you think that's it? Everybody in therapy, could that be the thing? And it's like, yeah, everybody knows that except for you, and so some of that, it's like, well, maybe you're worried about nuclear weapons because nuclear weapons are scary. I like to do that now. You surface it and then people kind of go, yeah, no, maybe, it's good to talk about it. So that's my view is that there's so much underground psychological material. There's so much unconscious psychological material, and the nuclear industry in its orientation towards technology has been sort of the least equipped to deal with that subterranean spiritual life that is there beneath the nuclear waste canisters, so to speak.
Hi, I'm Alexa, and I'm a master's student. I was actually going to write about nuclear in my master's thesis, but I pivoted to the IMF and its change in discourse towards the climate transition, which has only been the last 3-4 years. And I, looking through, because it's very much in the beginning stages, I saw that there is a working paper published about the possibilities of nuclear. So I was wondering what you think is necessary for the IMF to actually put nuclear in the forefront of
attacking them relentlessly,
and now
publicly.
The last question, then you.
Okay.
I'm Søren. I'm sure you're familiar with a guy called Jesse Jenkins.
Of course.
He does steady, low carbon sources of energy. What is your take on the debate for what's the mix? What is the mix we're looking for in a low carbon world 2050?
Sure. Well, let's start with the IMF because that's more fun. You should relentlessly attack them and embarrass them if you can. That's the most important thing to do with the IMF. IMF scandalously produced a report that described the externalities of carbon emissions, of climate change, as a subsidy. All it did, so it came out with this ridiculous report saying that somehow the world gives, do you remember this, trillions of dollars of subsidies for fossil fuels? It was like offensive, like at an analytical level of what it was doing, just by switching the word, by saying externalities are subsidies now. Yeah, I mean, if you completely change the meaning of something. So I would go after them the same way with the ESG question that he had. You have to embarrass these institutions. You have to. So for me, I do journalism in part so you can call people up and be like, hi, what were you thinking when you wrote this? So that's what I would encourage you to do. And then write an op-ed for the biggest newspaper you can, describing why is the IMF manipulating and allowing the corruption of its, because IMF at least, I mean, I don't know. I mean, these institutions were at one point supposed to have honest analytical work. They could be engaged in all sorts of mishigas and other ways, but they were supposed to have some kind of scholarly robustness and academic quality, and that went out the door with that terrible externality subsidy conflation. So let me know how I can help you. michaelshellenberger@gmail.com is my email. I'll be delighted to. I read a Forbes column citing your research.
Energy mix in 2050.
Energy mix. I love Jesse. Jesse's my friend. He was my employee for many years. He's brilliant. This idea of that he's out of Princeton is going to decide energy mixes, I think, is absurd. I prefer the picture I prefer is this picture of energy transitions, which is direction of travel. So it's my mix is just much simpler. If you have coal and you can move to natural gas, you should do that, because natural gas is obviously better than coal, even if you don't think climate change is much of a concern. It just produces a lot less air pollution. And if you don't, can you go nuclear? Can you build a nuclear power plant? Well, then do that. So when Jesse talks to policymakers, he says, well, let me try to create this mix of what it should be, and I'm going to use cost-benefit analysis. I'm not crazy about that, because first of all, I don't think that's how decisions are actually made by policymakers. They have to weigh all sorts of interest groups and all sorts of other analyses, and they've just lost sight of the basic issue of what's better and worse. If you have a nuclear power plant, you don't want to go back to natural gas. If you have natural gas, see if you can go to nuclear. That's my view. I also sometimes hear Jesse say things like suggesting that nations need renewables. That's not true, that nations don't need renewables. France shows that when you have a heavy nuclear mix and you add a lot of wind energy, then you have to also add more natural gas. And so France, we saw between, I believe, 2014 and 2018, recarbonized its electricity supply by adding a lot of wind and gas and reducing the amount of nuclear. So I'm not crazy about this idea that we need renewables. My view is what he's saying is he's making a political calculation that in order to build societal and political consensus for a low carbon energy supply, that he needs to sort of embrace every low carbon energy technology. So whether that's renewables or nuclear, they want a kind of happy family between renewables and nuclear. I just don't think it's completely honest in the sense that you can be Sweden and France. You don't need to add you don't need to have wind or solar. And in many ways, if you add those, you're going to make things worse. So, but Jesse and I have a personal relationship that precedes our professional one. So I've refrained from criticizing him publicly. I guess that's over now, isn't it? But we have a disagreement about this. I respect him. I think his intentions are in the right place. It's not the way that I think we should explain the ideal electricity mix to policymakers.
Go out there, and if you haven't done it already, buy Michael Shellenberger's book. It's a great book. We don't have it here. There were logistics problems. The global transportation chain is fucked up at the moment, and they couldn't give us any specific date for when the book would be here, and I just couldn't face the risk of the book turning up tomorrow and standing there with 150 copies of your book. But it's a great book, but 150 copies.
No, and it sold because San Francisco, my new book came out, and then it turned out that they didn't anticipate, but Apocalypse never sold out, and so they just had to go back to a new printing. So.
Oh, that's why.
So that's why.
I was wondering. Okay.
Yeah, but it should be available for Christmas. So, so just in case you need a Christmas idea, please buy it.
I think that's a proper ending.
Thank you so much, Martin. Thank you.
Join me in thanking Michael Shellenberger.
Thank you. Nice.
And thank you so much for turning up.